Second lesson from the first book of the Kings, chapter 19. Elijah rose and ate and drank, and sustained by this food he went on for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. He entered a cave, and there he spent the night. Suddenly the word of the Lord came to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" "Because of my great zeal for the Lord," he said. "The people of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, torn down thy altars, put thy prophets to death with a sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life." The answer came, "Go and stand on the mount before the Lord." For the Lord was passing by. A great strong wind came, rending mountains and shattering rocks before him, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. Elijah is on the run, 250 miles for 40 days and 40 nights. Stretches credulity, really. But I can still identify with him because I'm on the run a lot. I'll bet you are too. Has there ever been a people as addicted to running as we are? And I'm not talking about the marathon this afternoon or this morning, is it already? Got to run now, I'm pretty busy, which means I have a full calendar, which means I am needed, which means I am important, or something like that. I think a moment's reflection, of course, makes it utterly clear that we are busier than anybody demands that we be. So what's it all about? In some measure, harmless, I suppose, but there may be a more serious side to it. We may, in fact, be running from ourselves, and particularly our anxious selves. In any event, that's the case with old Elijah. I first met him as a kid, didn't you? That story of his defeat of the evil prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, where God sends down earthquake and wind and fire to destroy the altar and the enemy. And then, of course, there's the song, "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." You know it, the story of Elijah's ride home to be with God. You can see them if you go there, a statue, a great ferocious figure with a sword raised in his right hand, ready to decapitate pagan prophets by the hundreds. And indeed, he remains a heroic figure centuries later in the minds of the people of Jesus' day. Elijah was to come back from the dead as a forerunner of the Messiah of God. And Elijah stands with Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration, supporting Jesus in his mission. Strange then to find him running for his life, cowering in a cave on far-off Mount Sinai, back where it all began with another brother, Moses, 4 centuries before. Running from what? Running from Jezebel, that power-hungry Phoenician woman. And for all his earthquake and wind and fire, she's still there. If you are Elijah, I am Jezebel, totally unimpressed. She does not go away. She sends him an email, "I will have your head." And so he runs for his life. Is there a chance that sometimes our running is a running for our life? A way of dealing with our Jezebels, the anxieties, the dreads, the specters in the night, the worries about our loved ones, the future, the uncertainties of the market, the health, the way the world is going. We run from it all. Worry, fear, dread, anxiety, because we live in a world full of threats. Oh, we prefer now to talk about stress. The word sounds a little less demeaning, doesn't it? I have been under quite a bit of stress lately. Sounds infinitely better than I've been scared to death lately. Or we turn really clinical and we talk about phobias, agoraphobia, claustrophobia. One magazine has added a few new ones: Charmin phobia, the fear of being squeezed, or Baba phobia, the fear of being fleeced. A man named Hartley had a morbid fear of thunder, and he went to a prominent psychiatrist who specialized in the treatment of just this phobia, which is called, by the way, brontophobia. Said the psychiatrist, just silly to be afraid of thunder at your age. Just think of it as a drum roll in the symphony of life. Hartley asked, will that cure my fear of thunder? Well, if it doesn't, said the doctor, you might try doing what I do. When you hear thunder, stuff your ears with cotton, crawl under the bed, pull a blanket over your head, and sing Mary Had a Little Lamb at the top of your lungs. But even if our running is not prompted always by our fears, it may tend to divert us from them just enough that we never really come to deal with them. But for Elijah, this ran out. He finds himself at the end of his run. And that can happen to us as well. Exhaustion sets in and we can go no further, or illness disables and we must crawl into some lonely bed. He finds himself at the end of his run, hiding in a cave on that mountain where Moses first met God in earthquake, wind, and fire. And they come again, as they did for Moses so long ago, even as they had for Elijah back on Mount Carmel. But they're no help. Fireworks, magics, the spectacular, so effective with those false clergy back on the mountain overlooking Haifa, prove no help for this lonely, frail, scared ex-servant of the Almighty. All the sensation and noise provide no relief, no release, nor do they for us. We live, do we not, in a day when we are bombarded incessantly by the exciting, the extravagant, the sensational, until we suffer, most of us, from sensory overload. Think of the telecast of the Bears game last Monday night. Or rather, don't think of the Bears game on telecast last Monday night. But I sat there and it was 3.5 hours of absolute blur of one visual flash, a noisy sound bite, and whir of color, one after the other, with a little football thrown in between. I ended up exhausted. The problem is that all of this coming at us from the outside cannot help but affect us inside, add to the uneasiness and agitation and disquiet, increasing the uncertainty and the low-grade anxiety, which is the inner environment in which so many of us live much of the time. Susan Smith Jones, a researcher, writes, those people who live in constantly noisy environments, who neglect to go inside their temple to listen to a bit of silence, are depriving themselves of one of life's most profound experiences. Unmitigated loudness, she writes, breeds agitation, aggression, disharmony within. Noise deafens the mind to the inner voice, to our connection to all of life, to any real peace and joy. You know, science has determined that noise is pathogenic, that it can cause disease in the human body. And not just in the inner ear, as was once believed. William Stewart, former Surgeon General of the U.S. Public Health Service, states that the noises of the 20th century are a major contributory factor in the deaths that even occur from cardiovascular problems. Noise must be considered a hazard to the health of people everywhere. So just stop and think how noisy our lives are, all the way from airplanes overhead to blaring TV to trucks roaring by us, on the Edens, earthquake, wind, and fire. But fortunately for Elijah, it does not end there, his overnight on that bald mountain. For all the racket, after all the racket from which comes no divinity, no healing, no peace, there comes, says the story, the sound of sheer silence. That's the exact literal translation. The old King James tried to make sense for us by talking about what? A still small voice. And thereby probably betrayed the heart of Elijah's experience. Have you ever found yourself in the presence of sheer silence? It's a rare experience. Marlene and I remember vividly the utter stillness of hours in total darkness on the top of that same mountain. A silence that was almost palpable. But what did it do for Elijah? What can it do for us? In the first place, it confronts us with ourselves and the anxieties that lurk just below the surface in probably all of us. Our initial reaction to absolute silence is very often uneasiness, a bit of discomfort as the fears and worries begin to surface, rather like they do when we lay awake in the stillness of a dark night. So silence can help us to confront our creatureliness, our helplessness before the Jezebels of this world, the goblins that go bump in the dark of night, of our minds, the very real threats and troubles that stalk us by light of day. The gift of silence is the gift of a confrontation of where we really are inside, so that we may let it go in God. To meet God in the silence is to meet the one reality to whom we can truly surrender the whole thing, our hopes and fears, our joys and our secret terrors. The great American psychologist of another era, William James, put it this way: the transition from tenseness, self-responsibility and worry to equanimity, receptivity, and peace is the most wonderful of all those shiftings of inner equilibrium, those changes of the personal center of energy. And the chief wonder of it is that it so often comes about not by anything we do, but by simply relaxing and throwing the burden down. The old prophet says much the same thing in those deceptively simple words: in quiet and in confidence is your strength, in rest and in trust are you made whole, alive, real. Amy Sullivan tells how it happened to her. Somehow a car's vanity license plate, she says, doesn't hold the same spiritual mystique or power of a night on God's mountain. But I experienced this a few weeks ago as I walked to work, self-absorbed as usual with such weighty, consuming issues as to why I can't figure out a career path, or why someone's playing kickball with my emotions, or why John Hofmeyr won the 6th grade student council presidency when anyone could see I was eminently more qualified for a political career. These are the sort of thoughts that developed into a full-blown pity party in your head, with your id and ego throwing confetti and dancing to Fire and Rain, and everybody eating tubs of ice cream and commiserating with one another. Well, within this fog of recriminations and cries for justice, a heaven-sent message manifested itself. Let go. The words appeared on the back of a blue Mazda Miata, which was sort of odd because growing up near Detroit, I had always assumed that God was an American car kind of guy. For a moment, I felt like the woman in the Yellow Pages commercial who finds the ad on the side of a bus changing to correspond to her thoughts. As I connected the command to the toxic musings that had been filling my brain, I could only lean my head back and laugh. God knows me very well. There's no point in using subtlety. And I let go. Nor was God subtle with Elijah, but it was only when he became still that God and trust came and Jezebel and his fears began to ebb. What do we hear if we truly become silent, devoid of any sound around? We hear ever so softly, as it were, be still and know that I am God. Somewhere I ran across a card which said, when in the silence your heart really speaks, take careful notes. Without shutting off the noise without and shutting down the chatter within, we rarely come to that peace, which is renewed perspective on life and renewed power in life. Perspective, wallowing in self-pity. Elijah moans, the whole world out there is going to the dogs. I'm the only one left. I'm the only one who cares about right and wrong. But in the silence comes the realization, not true. There are at least 9,000 who feel the same way you do. Restoration of perspective. Time alone is time when we get a little bit of distance from life and regain some sense of what is important and what is not important. It's a matter of recognizing what is of consequence and worth worrying about and what is in the long run pretty trivial and passing. I think part of the problem for life with all of us is caught up in the continual and obsessive activity and running, living constantly bumping elbows, continually battered by external stimuli, mad or melodic, is that everything takes on equal urgency, and that wears us down quicker than anything. The truth is this: there are people whose opinion of you is really not all that important. There are possessions that you can do quite nicely without, thank you. There are successes you really do not have to achieve to be outrageously happy. There are places you do not have to see before you die. Although I'm still going to work on that one a little bit. Life is full of unimportant things. And when we get too invested and obsessed all across the board, we destroy both our efficiency and our serenity. Beverly Sills is a woman I've long admired whose life was laced with disappointment and tragedy. And in an interview some years ago, she was asked how she coped with all the disappointments in her life. Being snubbed by the musical establishment in Manhattan for years, the tragedy, think of it, of having a child born deaf so that she would never hear her mother's voice in song. How did she make it? She talked about what she called stillness. This is what she said: it really doesn't come until you're a mature human being. And I think that no matter what your work is, when it does descend upon you, it affects your work. It isn't that you feel you are more than everybody else and therefore their opinion doesn't count. It's simply that you realize that it's not important for everybody to love you. It's more important for you to love them. And it does turn your whole perspective around. The very act of living becomes the act of giving out of stillness. Perspective, and then I think purpose renewed. We need to get alone and quiet from time to time to revive some sense of direction that gets eroded so easily in the daily details of one darn thing after another. Elijah comes out of that sheer silence with a whole new sense of mission. The first word he really does hear God say is one word: go. Go back where you were, because you're going to anoint Hazael as state representative. Well, actually king, but you get the idea. Jesus goes off in the barren silence of the wilderness in order to sort out the direction his life is going to take, to be clear about what God wants. Life, always on the run, so easily loses its sense of direction. Dr. Raymond Flannery Jr. is assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School. He writes, "Who are the stress-resistant people? I became interested in this question as the result of some personal experiences and observations. One Saturday evening, after I myself had spent a frazzling day working with stressed-out people in a walk-in clinic, I turned to the nurse beside me, also working there, and said something like, 'Everybody and his brother went through here today.' And she looked at me and said, 'Now you know better than that, doctor. Some people never come here.' And I started to wonder who those people were. What do you think he discovered? Those with the least illness were also those personally committed to a mission of some kind. Might have been completing a college career long neglected, building a new business, being a better parent, advancing a community service, but in any case, these people were doing something that provided a sense of challenge, enhanced their sense of meaningful participation out beyond their own pains in real life." So what goals do we have lined up for the next 12 months or even the next month? Goals outside the fears that grab us, that excite us, organize us, give our lives focus. Every one of us ought to go into our own cave at least once in a while to listen to the sheer silence for a reason to be here, for the word coming from beyond that says, go. One thing is certain from the biblical experience: the test of whether you've encountered and surrendered to this God of the sheer silence, this God of the mountain, is whether you come away with a renewed sense of mission and purpose out beyond your own desires and indeed your own fears. Listen to the late Mother Teresa of Calcutta. We need to find God, and God cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is our friend in silence. The more we receive in silence, the more we can give in our active life. We need silence to be able to touch the souls of those around us. The essential thing is not what we say, but what God is able to say to us and through us. I still remember a parishioner whom I visited many years ago, you wouldn't know him, who was faced with serious heart surgery. I arrived during the considerable time he was recuperating in the hospital. Highly competent, respected businessman, a friend, accustomed to being in charge not only of the world around him, but his own life. And I remember quite well his answer to my typical question, how's it going? It went something like this: well, it's been tough, and I will admit, at times, pretty scary. I've rarely spent enforced downtime like this, and it's not been easy for me. I guess I've always been what you would call a control freak, or at least so my kids tell me. And it's been difficult to adjust to being so helpless and so dependent. If I had told you before I came in here that I would learn in this bed how to live, I would have thought you crazy. But in a way I have. In time, I've seen enough CNN and ball games on the television, and I've begun to relax and let things just happen. Anyway, a lot of the stuff I used to worry about seem a whole lot less important now. Gil, I have really come to peace with where I am and whatever the future may bring. And when I get out of here, I want to find something to do with my life which may perhaps make a difference. All because, like Elijah, he got stuck in a cave at the end of a long, hard run. So let's try to keep an eye out for the cave when it comes along. Amen.